Welcome. Thank you for coming to our second speaker in our I.D.E.A. book club series. I'd like to first thank the city of Edwardsville for allowing us to use the Wildey Theatre. We have Mayor Rambsy is here tonight, which is very exciting. Yay! I'd like to welcome Howard Rambsy. He's professor of literature at SIUE, where he has worked since 2003. He has taught a wide range of Black literature classes, as well as courses on rap music and comic books. He has coordinated more than 200 public humanities projects, including exhibits, audio productions, and reading groups, concentrating on African American literature and cultural history. He is the author of The Black Arts Enterprise, and most recently, Bad Men: Creative Touchstones of Black Writers. And in about a week or two, you can request both of these books at the Edwardsville Public Library. Yay! Dr. Rambsy.
It's very rare and commendable that you all read the Nickel Boys for a reading group, because usually people will choose like nonfiction, or they would choose something that's considered, again, serious books about race, and somehow fiction just falls off. And so it was very important for me, and something that I thought quite a bit about, that the idea that you all chose this book, a fiction book, because even though it's touching on a historical moment, you're still thinking about artistry, you're still thinking about style, you're still thinking about language as you read this book. And so that's something that really pushes us in a different direction, in a direction that I think is so important. One of the things that happens, unfortunately, after you have big moments like Black Lives Matter or things on college campuses like SIUE, you know, they have all these diversity initiatives, and those are really important. But the people who often get left out of diversity initiatives are often African-American students. There's not a lot of investment in African-American students, in part because like diversity is thought of something that you teach somebody something, and sometimes people will assume that Black students are somehow born knowing everything, and so they don't really get as much. And so I'm always excited when I see a reading group move in a different direction as this one was doing. So I wanted to just make sure I gave you all a shout on that. I thought about my own reading groups, though, that I organized. I teach a class, which I've been doing since I got here in 2003, and since 2004, I've taught a class for first-year Black men. And so we've been doing all kinds of reading groups since that moment. And the books we choose are sometimes different than the books club that I belong to that aren't comprised of young Black men. And so some of the books that we do, they think about comics, they think about graphic novels. There's a few poetry books that they think about quite a bit. And Ta-Nehisi Coates has meant quite a bit to them. I mean, he's meant to others. I found out something, though. The case for reparations stands out to those students a lot more than his book, Between the World and Me. And I think one of the reasons why, and I mean, it goes with what I was saying about there's little investment in Black students when there's a big push for diversity. Every time we read the case for reparation, those young Black men are so excited to be learning all of this history. It's one of the few times that folks really push it, and they get this from a Black male writer. Usually when Coates is pushed in a public way, he's pushed as somebody who's just telling his story, which is important. But I think my young men students, they have their own story to tell, but they're most fascinated when he's telling a history of Black people and a history of racism. So we're at number 4. The last few slides, I just wanted to say a little bit about coverage and the reception of the Nickel Boys. So I've been giving you all this larger context, and I just wanted to say a little bit about some of the responses to Colson Whitehead. He wrote The Underground Railroad, and it was chosen by Oprah. And one of the things that kind of horrified me when she was talking, because I had been following him since since about 2000, a year after his first book came out. And so in 2016, when she chose his book and she interviewed him, she says, oh, you know, I've never, he had written 7 books by that point. And Oprah said to him, you know, I had never heard about you before this. And I was just like, oh my God, you know, like, and you know, it is not her fault, because I'm sure a million things that I should know about. My students remind me every time we walk in the classroom, like it's so many rappers and entertainers I don't know anything about, and they're just like, oh my God, Rambsy, you don't know who that is? Anyway, I wish I could talk to Oprah, because I was gonna say, you don't know who that is, you know, but that was the first time she heard of him. But between that moment when she discovered him And then by the time he wrote The Nickel Boys, he had just become so widely known in part because of that. One, it was because of her popularity and her promoting the book, and also it's a really good book. And two, it just so happened President Obama put him, Colson Whitehead's This Is One of the Books I've Been Reading, so that caused it. So he did really well after that, and by 2019, when The Nickel Boys was about to come out, Time Magazine did a cover, and they said America's Storyteller, which I thought was a big statement. So that just gives you some sense of kind of the coverage and the reception that he was having at this point, going from this writer that I was trying to figure out, will people take him serious, to now being a writer that's considered like America's storyteller. So that was one that was kind of interesting. This is more detail on the actual book. We're at number 3, by the way. So I just got 3 more slides for you all, just in case you were wondering. It's hard for me to read this book. I don't know about you, but it's hard for me to read this book and think about Elwood and Turner and not think about Malcolm and Martin. And I know the thing with Martin and Malcolm is somewhat overplayed, right? People talk about the differences in their tensions, because they actually met just once. In the photo I show here, they just met one time during their lifetime. But people talk about them, and there are plays, multiple plays and stories imagining these two having a debate with each other, or the tensions that they have with each other coming out. So it's hard for me not to think about them as we were looking at, or we were reading The Nickel Boys, right? Because you're thinking about this one guy who's very optimistic, and some would even say naive, and then you have another one who's very straight to the point, has a kind of militant mind. So anyway, that's something that I thought about as I was reading this, and just thinking about that Malcolm Martin thing. And it goes beyond Martin and Malcolm, because you can think about other folks, W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T, W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois and a whole lot of other people, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, Nas and Jay-Z. There are all these kind of tensions that you can think about with prominent black men, and how that tension creates a space for creativity. So anyway, I think that was something that Colson Whitehead was perhaps, if he wasn't thinking about Malcolm and Martin, he was certainly thinking about this long history of how you have these two characters who are supposed to be alike, two black boys, but then having them have very different views on the world. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Let me see if there we go. This other one is something you notice if you read this book. Man, there's a lot of violence in there. And it's a violence that think about this space. The Dozier School, or Nickel as they call it in the book. But there's also the fight scene in this series, and those connect to different famous fight scenes in literature and also other places. But I mention it because there's been this big debate going on across in American culture, but particularly in black representations. People are wondering, like, how much violence should be shown and not shown? When we show violence in a film, when we show violence in a book, is it kind of reproducing the violence that those of us who are against that are supposed to be against? So anyway, I thought about that as I was reading this book, and about the violence that's there. What does it mean to show the violence? And I think Colson Whitehead does a good job of not overindulging in that violence, but it still comes up for you, right? It's still something you have to think about, and it persists throughout African American literature. My colleague Liz Cowley and I are going to be doing an NEH Institute next month on Frederick Douglass, and we have to always open, because on the second or third page, Frederick Douglass is showing this brutal whipping of his aunt by one of their owners, right? And some folks say, hey, we shouldn't keep showing that over and over again. Remember I showed you all Emmett Till earlier. And some people say, yeah, that was brave of his mother to show his body, and it helped address racism. But some folks say we shouldn't keep showing that image. Mike Brown, people say we shouldn't keep showing that image of him laying on the ground dead. We should not keep showing the images of George Floyd. So anyway, that idea about how much violence should we show to make people take it seriously is really fascinating to me. And it's a big issue. Because on the one hand, let's just take George Floyd. On the one hand, I'm like, hey, please, we don't need to see it again. But then there's another very logical part of me that thinks like, wow, if people hadn't seen that, would they have believed how bad it was? And even me, if you had told me, hey, they were on this guy's neck for 9 minutes, I would not have, like, you couldn't believe that. And and I don't even like to be in places when they say, hey, we're gonna hold a moment of silence for 9 minutes and 20, that's very hard and uncomfortable. It gets difficult in my college classrooms when I say any questions, anything, and everybody, and I do a thing where I'll just stand there. And students will always ask questions because they are just so uncomfortable. Like they don't want to ask questions, but they are even more uncomfortable with their silence. What if I said, let's be quiet for 9 minutes? Anyway, so that violence thing is something I've thought about. It's not just something I have an answer for, but I just wanted to introduce it to you if you hadn't thought about it. So when you do encounter it in African-American literature, you'll know that this is something people are really trying to work through. They're really trying to work through that issue. That's number 2. And then number 1, which is a little bit more abstract, but this is something I've been thinking quite a bit about, and that's creative domains. And it's just a saying that like when you belong in one area, like one area of expertise you might belong to, is thought of as a creative domain. Jill and Jacob are librarians, so the library is a kind of creative domain for them. But they might have some other thing that they're very knowledgeable about, and that becomes another domain for them, right? And so, for instance, Jill was saying that she had lived in Switzerland to me just right before this started. And so her knowledge about Switzerland is another domain. So can you imagine her being in a spot where she's thinking about libraries, but she's also thinking about this place called Switzerland? And so those things could overlap. And she could tell a story about libraries in Switzerland. And for those who don't know much about Switzerland, you'd be kind of lost, but that library part would kick in and you say, oh, I know about that. Or you could be someone who's in Switzerland who don't think much about libraries, but you say, oh, but wow, I know this place called Zurich. I know these watches, why they matter quite a bit here. Anyway, I've only been to Zurich. It was a beautiful city, by the way. But anyway, so you see what I'm saying, these creative domains. That's something Colson Whitehead has done really well, and it's something that I think brought us into this book, because he has so many different creative domains that he was playing off of. On the one hand, he's telling you a story about these little boys who are kind of struggling to find their way. That's one creative domain, but he's also talking about a very specific place in Florida. He's also telling you this story about what it means to be a black boy and listening to a figure on a recording. He's listening to these recordings of MLK, and I really was moved by that. That's the technology part for me to think about that, because you rarely come across a novel where somebody's listening this closely to recordings. But it meant something to me is because it reminded me of discovering tapes when I was younger of Malcolm X. And I was so captivated by these tapes, recordings of Malcolm X. Anyway, so that's another creative domain. It's also a kind of, what would you say, a kind of prison movie, right? A prison narrative. And so that's another domain. And so he's blending those domains. So this idea when you blend domains for people like that they sort of catch on. And it's also, like I told you, it's a Black Lives Matter narrative, right? Like this book is put out, he starts thinking about it in 2014, right as Mike Brown is happening. And then it comes out in 2019. Like many people were still getting killed by police. So this idea that this is another domain, so this idea of creative domains, people mixing and matching those domains, really stood out to me. His very first novel, The Intuitionist, it's a book about elevators. But at the very beginning, the elevator crashes, and the whole time people saying, who made it crash? So it's a detective novel, right? Since it's about elevators, it's also a kind of science fiction piece, right? I should also tell you this. It's set in a city that it seems that it's New York City, but they never say it's New York City. Just like this place called Gotham in DC Comics. So it's also a kind of comic book, and like DC Comics, but then to flip you even further, he literally has a character from a Marvel Comics walk through the book, who's just hanging out in the book. So it's a Marvel book, it's a DC Comics book, it's a detective novel, it's a science fiction novel, it's an African-American novel, And it focuses on this woman character who's highly intellectual. So it's a certain kind of feminist read, right? So it's all of these things. So anyway, he's really good on mixing creative domains. And that's what he does, I think, to many degrees in the Nickel Boys. So this idea of creative domains is something that's just really been fascinating me, how people mix and match, pull things together. And that's zero. So thank you all for listening. I will say this, I'm going to give this PowerPoint to Jill, she'll put it up, but if you click on that, or if you can just go, I have a site, it's called Cultural Front, and so many of the things I talked about today, I wrote about, and I told you I'll have a list. I mentioned Black Lives Matter writing, so I put a list up, so you can go there and see some of the writings, just a small number of the writings there. And something else, but aside from that, thank you for listening, thank you for having me.
Question. So one thing that we talked about in the book discussion was this pattern in Nickel Boys where we had so much hope that something good was finally going to happen, and then we were just crushed. You know, just for example, like Elwood is going to college. No, he's not. Or he's going to keep his head down and get out early. And even what was the boy's name who escaped? Yeah, when Clayton escaped and, he got new clothes and he was driving away and, just over and over this happened. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more and what maybe Colson Whitehead was hoping to achieve with that.
Oh, yeah, I think just to send us through these changes, probably, I think that's the big thing. But also, I think it's fascinating because when I was listening to him in interviews about this book, one of the things he talked about is just how the capacity of humans to do terrible things to each other. And that just hearing that fact is, disappointing and painful. But it was especially painful from him because I'll tell you, before this book, and maybe before the Underground Railroad as well, when I tell you this guy is joking all of the time, like in interviews too, you could just never get a straight answer from him. And he's like I said, he was like, oh yeah, I enjoy talking about race. And I had never heard a writer say it quite like that. They're usually like, yeah, we're gonna have to deal with this serious thing called race. But he would get in an interview and say, oh, I enjoy talking about race, right? And so I think part of it is just being this storyteller and knowing that and really trying to match that to how things are. You're constantly encountering these disappointments, and that's putting it mildly, but you're constantly encountering these places where you think somebody's getting away, but then it's the sad kind of outcome. And especially in Black communities, I hear people talk about all of this potential that someone had, but then something happened, and it took them off. People thought MLK was going to lead this thing. They thought all this was going to happen. He's assassinated. Before that, it's Malcolm. They think all of this stuff is going to happen. Then, and in fact, Malcolm is even changing some of his philosophies. And right then, it happened. So I think if you've just been a student of African-American life in some ways, you start seeing these kind of ups and downs like that. I think about that with these books, though, right? I mean, you will see these writers who will do really well. They will get these awards on the one hand, but then you think about large numbers of Black people who are struggling, and then it's it's such a mix there. It's such a mix there. So anyway, I think just following along with that and being a good storyteller, knowing, hey, I have to keep coming back to these serious, trying, there goes serious, just keeps showing up, doesn't it? Anyway, so dealing with these kind of topics that seem to be in the flow of things.
I'll come to you. Oh, that's one. So you said your favorite book is whichever one you're currently rereading. With this twist, I mean, I think maybe that's the most playful thing for me as reading this as a novel. You're reminded the way he chooses to withhold
Yeah.
what he withholds and when to deliver that to you in his framework. So how long until you want to jump right back into at least the prologue and see how it all checks out when you finished the pre-pub when you got it?
Oh, you said how long did?
This is my first day. So how long after finishing the first read did you want to just jump right back into reading Nickel Boys?
Probably, well, two things. One, yeah, you're right. That twist, I was actually so relieved. I mean, I was like, yeah, he got me. But at the same time, I was so relieved because I was like, do you mean he's going to do a whole book and there's no jokes? So I took that as the biggest joke of all, right? Like, he got me this whole time where he does this twist towards the end. But I probably went right to, what did I do at that time? Two things. I probably went back. I always go back to after I read something, I start going back to some earlier work and thinking about the things I missed. Because I can tell you, when I first read The Intuitionist, I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, like, I took that book very seriously. I mean, part of it is because the vocabulary, this is why my students, like, detest this book. They are like, Rambsy, you have to look up all of the words just to understand what he's saying. And, I love it when they say that because I get them, because that's what, when Oprah Winfrey read Beloved the first time, she was having all kind of trouble understanding things. So she called Toni Morrison. And I learned something about that too, because she called Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison was living in Ohio at the time, and so Oprah called the fire department. I didn't know this. You could call the fire department and say, hey, what's somebody's phone number? And, or at least in small towns. So she called the fire department and said, hey, what's Toni Morrison's phone number? And they gave it to her. So she called Toni Morrison and said, hey, this is Oprah Winfrey. She says, I've been covering your book, Beloved. And she said, and I like you, preface, and I like your work, but I will go over something in this book, and then I have to go over that again just to make sense of it. And she said, what's happening with that? And Toni Morrison said, oh, that's called reading. So anyway, the students will say that about the intuitionist, so I'm just sitting there waiting when they're going over it and they're telling me how hard. And I say, yeah, that's called reading. It don't mean the same when it comes from me and not Morrison. But anyway, so I probably went back to the intuitionist because when I read that book the first time, I took it very seriously. Because of the vocabulary, because of the structure. It was some jokes in there, but I was not missing them. So I was like, wow, he's a very serious writer. I went and read John Henry Days next. I mean, it came out like a little bit after. And I read it and said, oh my goodness, this is my favorite. And nobody knew him then, because Oprah didn't even know him. So nobody knows him so I feel like I discovered him. So I read John Henry Day, and that book is just, the jokes are just so up front. And so I said, oh my God, let me go reread this book and see what I missed. And so I think with the Nickel Boys, I'm not sure which one, but I probably went, somehow his books inspired me to think, dag, I had to have missed something with the last books. And then actually when I was getting ready for this, I was like, oh goodness, I was so excited that you all invited me. But then as I was reading, I was like, oh, I had missed so much. One small thing that he doesn't include here in the advanced copy, this here is that little note, the preface at the beginning of the Nickel Boys, where he talks about how he usually he switches his work up and things like that. That preface in all the editions, so it was fascinating to see that. So that was it. But yeah, I'm sure I went and reread something of his. It's a trip because I get caught in this cycle. But I'm so glad he keeps writing these new works, so I get to keep following. I keep getting to discover something new all of the time. Oh.
How often do you reread his books?
His books, you know what? I would say, I don't know, I don't even have a reference point for how often. But not that much. I mean, it's never going to go a year where I'm not rereading something of his. But it's also changing for me a little bit because I've been introducing a number of his essays. He does essays here and there. So I've been going over those with my students. So I'm constantly rereading those. it's one of the struggles, I think, if you're a literature professor, and I think it might be why fiction writers sometimes get irritated with us, because fiction writers, my colleague Valerie, they're constantly moving forward. They're moving forward. But if you're teaching things, like, you will end up just reteaching these things or teaching things that have come out a long time ago, just because it's so new to your students. So yeah, so anyway, but I think now his essays, when it comes to his essays, we're gonna read something at least once an academic year, if not every semester. I'm gonna read something of his. Colson Whitehead and Ta-Nehisi Coates have somehow become like two of my major young writers. I say young because, Frederick Douglass and Toni Morrison and Amir Baraka in my universe. But those two writers I just constantly come back to. And fortunately for me, both of them are really prolific. And also, it's just cool because I kind of found them before they were really big writers. And so that was really helpful for me to have, just seen them at an early stage, and then I feel like a certain kind of commitment to have been following their career. Like, oh, wow, this is where they ended up. It's really fascinating.
You talked about the Nickel Boys book being ripped from the headlines, and I just wondered if you know how much research he did into the actual school, and if there's any events from the book that were based off of events from the real school.
Oh yeah, like remember he talks about the White House, right? That's like a real thing. And I don't know if I think they all have, either they're taking it down now, they're about to take it down, but I think they were gonna get rid of it because they were just a symbol. But he did quite a bit because that was one of the things I think that really inspired him. Once he started looking into it, he found out that there were these support groups for the boys who were now men who were abused there. And they were advocating, hey, somebody needs to make a statement, the governor or something like that. But what he noticed there were no, the black boys were not represented. That's why that line in there, he says, who speaks for the black boys? Who was going to speak for the black boys? It was time somebody did. And so that line was the one that I took from the advanced copy and put as the epigraph of my own book, who will speak for these black boys. But yeah, he did quite a bit of research and just thinking about the space and how it was set up. And if you go online, these days, that kind of research is much easier to do. So yeah, he did quite a bit of research on it. I think he didn't go to the physical place until after the book was out, though, which is kind of fascinating to me. I think about this a lot, though, with him because he's a very New York writer. Everything about him in New York. So when he's covering the South, I'm so fascinated. I'm from the South, and so I'm always thinking, wow, what does it mean that this quintessential New York writer gets both of his Pulitzer Prizes on books that are set in the South? It's such a weird situation. It's a weird kind of setup to me. I don't know. It's just so fascinating. It's I don't know. It's like Jay-Z now lives in California. I'm like, man, you can't live in California. Who's the king of New York now? So anyway, it's yeah, this guy's writing about the South. But yeah, I was amused by that. He didn't even go there until. But then on the flip side, I laugh sometimes when people say, oh, we have to go there to research. But it's always sometimes when people go to a very exotic place. And I wonder about that. But anyway, it was, yeah. So but he apparently did quite a bit of research on the Dozier School for Boys.
You mentioned your books. I'm just wondering what your books are based on or what they're about.
Thank you for asking that. Wow. Hey, imagine that. I didn't even bring one of my own books, but I was thinking so much about. I was literally looking at the shelves, which book am I going? Which 6 books should I bring of Colson Whitehead? That was literally the debate. So the first book I wrote is on the Black arts movement in the 1960s and 70s. And it was my first book. And so you know how it is, your first book. I was talking to some young people today, and I was trying to get them to understand why I don't even like to think about my first book, because it was 10 years ago. And they were 19. So I said, can I see your writings from when you were 9 and 10? I said, so that's how I feel. But anyway, my most recent book is called Bad Men, and it's about creativity. So I meant to warn you all at the beginning of this that I was going to be repeating the words creativity quite a bit and things like creative domain because I thought so much about those terms. And so the book is called Bad Men, but it focuses on bad men, just generally how so many of us are inspired by bad men to create these various things, whether they're narratives that people make up in their head or whether they're poems and other things. And then the other part of that is talking about black boys, though, why black boys matter so much to writers in terms of the things they shape. Now, I would say black women writers, they spend a lot of time writing inspired by black boys, too. Sometimes because the black boys are kind of irritating to them, so they write about that. But sometimes because they're very interested, some are mothers, and they're thinking about their sons. But black men writers, they spend quite a bit because they were black boys themselves, perhaps, but they spend so much time thinking about black boys. And so that was something I thought about. Because my book closes with Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, and it was about how Ta-Nehisi Coates and this reporter named Trymon Lee, how they just were obsessed with these guys, writing about these little boys, particularly Trayvon Martin. Before Trayvon Martin was something you and I knew about. They were and I even make the argument that we know about Trayvon Martin because of Ta-Nehisi Coates and Trymon Lee, the way that they just wrote obsessively over those guys. So you start saying, dang, who are these people? And anyway, so that's what it's about, that creativity, an idea of creativity. It's been a long road, though, man, because I was saying when I showed up here, Julie Hanson was a humanities librarian, and I was talking to her about Colson Whitehead. And Valerie who's still running a magazine at SIUE called Southwester, and she let me write an essay on Colson Whitehead there and publish it there. And so it's just funny that those ideas were when I showed up, and it's just now getting up into a book. So, God. Anyway.
You were talking about, you teach literature, and you were talking about serious and fiction, and I personally am drawn to history because of fiction. That's what I would have started reading first. So I read a fictional historical novel that I love, and that makes me want to dig into some nonfiction about it. And I'm just curious about your first-year students. Do you feel like that sometimes really good fiction like that is a gateway into more serious study into the nonfiction that will really give them a broader, or do you think that they respond just as well to nonfiction?
I think they do just the opposite of what you said, right? You said you start with the fiction, and then that makes you get in. Well, you said sometimes you do it. It's hard to convince them about fiction. I think I have to work harder on the fiction part just because, I don't know. I really have to think about it. But some of it is, I think they've had certain kind of bad experiences with it. They hadn't had a certain kind of leisure with it. And they also just hadn't had a whole lot of choices. So when I just mentioned novels, they just, it's the groans and it's hard. And so I've been running these online reading groups at SIUE for a group of about 100 students every year since, 2010. And I used to do novels, but I realized something with the novels. When the students get behind, they would just quit. So one of the things I've been doing in recent years, I don't know why it took me so long, I started doing short story collection. And that's been so helpful for them because they'll say, I missed that short story, but I can catch up on this one. And they don't feel so far behind. It's like streaming television sometimes, when somebody tells you about a show, if you feel like you're too far behind, you just won't even watch it, So I don't know why we do that. I could list some shows with you all. You'd be horrified if you know I hadn't watched that show. But it was because I was like, you all too far ahead, Anyway, so I really like that with the short story. But I was thinking, wow, I wish someone had done more of that when I was coming, because I would have really enjoyed exploring certain ideas. But they really have just limited experiences, and they tend to be bad. So, they're much more into nonfiction for some reason. Like the Case for Reparations, I was reading it with these guys, and they really had a strong connection to that because, I should add this part. all of the guys in my class, young black men, the majority of them are from Chicago. I don't know if you all, those of you who are connected to SIUE, the majority of the black students are from Chicagoland, is what they call it, because it's sometimes all around Chicago. So the case for reparation, he spends a lot of time talking about Chicago. So it's not just that they like nonfiction. They were like really connected, like, oh my God, we didn't know redlining explains how our neighborhood is set up this way, but we never knew that. And he would mention these projects that are no longer there, and they were fascinated by that. So yeah, that's another thing, just getting people material, younger people material that first is connected to their world and then expanding it out. So I'm rambling because I began by saying they were just the opposite of you, but they're actually just like you. Like, you read something and then it makes you ask different questions. And so they were, yeah, they're like that. They were just like, but you just have to, it's all about how you introduce them to things. That's something I've learned. Like, how do you introduce people to a topic is crucial. And just giving them options. Whoa, I feel bad about that at college because we privileged in a way because we can do certain kind of exciting things that sometimes is just difficult. You know, high school teachers, they just got so many other things to think about. So they don't always get to experiment the way we do and the trial and error we do. So anyway.
If you're curious why I'm the way I am with this microphone, we're recording this so it picks up better on the video.
Oh, no, maybe I shouldn't ask this then. So thank you.
Oh, no, thank you for
also,
coming.
my first public social outing in a minute. So, I'm just stuck on something. It's not a question, but I just wondered if you would talk through it a little bit. So when you put the Time magazine cover up with America's Storyteller, the next thing I thought of, I was thinking about this seriousness versus playfulness, and can you be playful and serious? And I immediately thought of Morrison being called America's conscience.
Oh, wow.
And I was thinking about that contrast of, like, he's the storyteller, she's the conscience, and where playfulness falls in the line of being a storyteller versus, it's not a question.
Yeah. Nah, that's great. I guess I should have said that, like, years before this, Toni Morrison was on Time magazine cover, and that was such a big deal. And I guess something else I should say to the person who asked about my book, so thank you for that, because I never get to talk about my book. It somehow came out during the goddamn pandemic at the start of it. I was like, goodness, of all the times. Anyway, one of the big discoveries for me when I was studying creativity research was playfulness, and how playfulness is connected so much to creativity. And I was even surprised to learn how comedians were scoring so much higher on these creativity tests that people would do. At first I was surprised, but then it made so much more sense. But anyway, so I just wanted to say that because when we're talking about the playfulness, like that playfulness I used to think was an add-on for Colson Whitehead, but it's central to his creativity. That's how he even maneuvers creativity, because it's not just playful in jokes. It means, let me rearrange something. You know, they gave me a story and said, white boys are being abused at this school. And his mind played, so he said, oh, let me change that. The black boys are being abused at this school. So anyway, that's that. And so the Toni Morrison and Colson Whitehead comparison, yeah, it's very interesting because she's always viewed as like this very serious person. I was trying to think of, because I've known a few people who knew her, and I know that she had to be playful in some ways, but it just, like her writing, and it isn't funny things that happen in her work, but you got to look for it in her work. I'm telling you, when you read any of Colson Whitehead's other books, you're going to open the first page and you're going to be laughing. You're like, oh my goodness. So anyway, so that's it. But yeah, that storyteller versus America's consciousness is because even storytellers already set up in the realm of entertainment in a way no one would do with Toni Morrison. Even though I felt like she was just really, I'm not saying anything. She was one of our most wonderful storytellers, though. It's almost unfair that a person could tell stories the way she does. One of the things you can look at with Toni Morrison and Colson Whitehead, which is very different from many black writers, when people review them, they will talk about like how they're shaping ideas. They will talk about their techniques. They don't usually do that with other writers. They'll just talk about other black writers. Like, here's what their book is about. But with a lot of their work, Colson Whitehead, that's how I knew. I was like, oh, this guy's special early on, because they were saying, he's like, look at the way he's dealing with ideas. That's it's sad, but it's rare for people to talk about black writers like that. Black writers are usually brought in when you want to talk about, oh, let's talk about racism and let's talk about this and that. But people rarely bring black writers in as examples of people who have ideas, like, which is itself a whole nother problem and struggle. While he's going, thank you all again for being here. It's so rare. Like, this is literally my first time out in public, for a year. So I didn't even know how I was going to even function in the world. So anyway, thank you.
And thank you. Something you said much earlier, and as you give answers to some of these questions, it's still in my head, so I just want to bring it up. When you were talking about science fiction, when we were talking about literary fiction, my first science fiction book that I read a couple years ago was Octavia Butler's.
Hey, you right on the right page.
Yeah, so I'm just kind of curious what you think of her work in the context of literary fiction. Is it possible to have science fiction be also literary fiction?
Oh yeah, and she's the person who gets put up there now. I don't think when she first started out, it was like that. She wasn't Octavia Butler, African American science fiction writer. When she first came, I don't even think many people, but in particular, I don't think African Americans paid attention much to her. Part of it is because of the marketing. Next time I'm in Edwardsville hanging out at the library, I'm gonna have to bring covers and show you. When she was first brought out, they would literally put white characters on the front of her books. And so nobody even knew that this was a black woman writer. It was only later that they found out, oh, wow, black women read books. And so it was bad. It took that long. So now her books are marketed heavily as African American. But it also means scholars became very interested. And so her words on the page didn't change, but the reception changed. And so it's interesting. They kind of put her in literary, like serious fiction, which lets me know that those kind of boundaries are sometimes just artificial and arbitrary anyway, right? Because she was always writing like that. But now when we say Octavia Butler, oh, wow, that's serious. But when her books were first coming out, people would it was not that kind of apparatus around them. It's these things that you take really seriously. It makes me think about, I teach a comic book class at SIUE, and the folks in the class know, and I co-teach it with someone, and they know that I think a lot about Star Wars. And so it's funny because it took me a while to admit that, because at first I wouldn't like to admit that. I couldn't be telling people that I'm into Star Wars. I'm a literature professor. Or I couldn't say, hey, I read these comic books. But then I was at the comic book store and I bumped into my colleague, Joel Hartman. I said, oh, though I don't know if that helped me though. But anyway, and then one of my office mates, Jeff Schmidt, he was talking about comics, and he would always, oh, you got to go borrow this from Joel. Joel has all the, so we three, and it's interesting how I had those conversations with them prior to teaching the class. So it's interesting the route I had to go. So anyway, Octavia Butler's like that. Nothing changed about her work, but the conversation elevated her work. I hate to even use elevated, God. But and it's like when we were saying serious. But the conversation around it placed it in this creative domain that was taken seriously, and that's how people do take her books now. Just one more quick point on that. They're this, what are they called? Thorn Willow Press. That's this press that does these hardcover. They will get in touch with the estate of a writer, and then they do these hardbound and leather-bound books around a writer. And so they've done editions of Octavia Butler, a couple of her books. And I mean, the books, you buy a book in a bookstore and they're like, $10, $15, something like that. When you get this letterbound, some of the books are $100. Some are, $500 to get it a certain kind of thing. They produce these maps. They produce that, and now they're going to produce an edition of Toni Morris. And I said, wow, look, imagine the world we live in now where Octavia Butler becomes the serious writer you look to first, and they say, oh, now we'll also cover this writer named Toni Morris. And so it's very interesting how that shifts and changes based on the conversation.
You and I talked about this briefly in the email exchange, but I just think it's so interesting, Roxanne Gay. So I think she's very interesting, and I like her book clubs, and I like listening to her. But I was surprised, I told you, that she was so offended by the Nickel Boys. She loved the book, but she was offended because all the female characters were just backdrops. That there was no strong woman portrayed at all. And then you had some interesting comments on that. I was wondering if you could share that with us.
Yeah, I'll share. Dang, wow. Now, I was like, oh, yeah, I'll surely share. And as I said, oh, wow, this is being recorded, too. So now I got to think about it. I was having a good time in email, though. I was having a good time, and so I'm going to say something, and then later y'all got to ask me when they turn the camera off what I really, really think. But I will say this, though, in all seriousness. I'm going to be really honest on what I think about this. Colson Whitehead and Ta-Nehisi Coates. There's this unspoken competition. I will call it competition. I hate to call it that. Let's call it... There's a certain kind of rivalry that kind of emerges in African-American literature and, let's say, the production of knowledge in general. And you can trace this back many, many years. But one of the reasons it's a struggle is because folks feel like there are limited opportunities for black people to get to express ideas to this general white public. And since there are limited opportunities to do so, attention comes from like who's getting to present, and if that person is presenting, then who's being left out, right? And so I think with some of the critiques that Ta-Nehisi Coates gets them more than anyone, and I guess some people could say some of those are legit, but the critique is like, if they're paying attention to this black male, then where are black women? And so I think that I agree with that general point. Like, oh, wow, yeah, like we do need to be thinking about a certain kind of balance in terms of people going to hear from black men and black women. So generally, where I disagree, though, with Roxanne Gay about the Nickel Boys is that, like, sometimes when you impose that same logic across everywhere, it just doesn't make sense. Like, this wasn't a school that had this school had boys in it. And so it would have been very interesting. I think it would have been a totally different book, and in some ways, I think a less book if he had focused on folks other than just these two boys. Because that was a lot, too. He could have written a book that could have just been on one of the boys and their experiences navigating it. So it was quite a bit to even focus on those two. So I didn't like, I had a few problems with her not even pausing into saying, like, yeah, it's sometimes unfair that we ask these guys to cover everything. And then my other problem with that is, I'll say sometimes you don't want that to happen. Like, you don't want to tell Colson Whitehead, hey, we feel like you should cover women too, because then he will go out and do it. And it might be better. Like, think about, nobody's really talked about it, but the Underground Railroad, the central character is this black woman. And I started wondering about what that means, that this black man produces this extraordinary work with this black woman as the lead. Will it cause people will they pick up that book and then not pick up, a book by now? People are going to still read Beloved. But what about Colson Whitehead's contemporaries, like black women? I think it's going to make them pause. So I sometimes think that's a problem. And I thought about it most with with Ta-Nehisi Coates, though, because he has a book that's a letter to his son, and people criticized him for not talking more about women. And they were basically asking him to make up, like, to insert, like, a daughter or to insert more women in that narrative. I think the truth is he didn't know the book was going to become that famous. Because I think if he had thought about it becoming that famous, then he would have tried to make it more expansive. And I didn't even mind some of those critiques, but when I started thinking about the critiques in a serious way was when I saw him in a discussion about his book, The Water Dancer. And it was Ta-Nehisi Coates and his editor, Chris Jackson. And they just, without any prompting, they started talking about everything they did to make sure they adequately represented black women in their work. And they said, well, we thought about the book, we reread it, we debated about it. We had one of the co-editors, who's a woman, we had her look at it and offer her serious critiques of it. Coates said, and then I had my wife look at it and say, hey, really, honestly, am I doing right about it? I mean, they did all of these things which were good and all of that, but I started saying, wow, one, I want to start criticizing them how they represent black males if it means they will go through all of that. And then I was like, I want to critique black women writers on how they represent black women if it will cause them, because it was just such a thorough process. And I said, wow, that was really interesting. So anyway, I sometimes think the critiques we make of leading black male writers ends up just improving them while leaving everybody else just not even do much. But anyway, I always thought that was an unfair argument. But this is one we're going to keep hearing, though, because it's so much bigger than me. And sometimes I heard Chris Jackson, the editor, say something because he said that Ta-Nehisi wanted to respond so often to everybody who was saying something. But he told him, nah, I don't respond. He said, a lot of times when they make that thing, that kind of critique, say they don't really care much about, for example, women. That's something about them. Like they're thinking about themselves. So anyway, in this case, I wonder about that. I said, oh, I wonder what that can tell me about Roxanne Gay more so than what it can tell me, and not good or bad, just wonder what it tells me. But I wonder what it says about her. Like, what is it that she wanted in that? So anyway, yeah, it was very interesting. One of my favorite novels is Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. And I was like, if she had kept writing black men like this, we wouldn't need anybody else to say anything about black men because she just mastered it so well. But anyway, I think that's it. But you all could say something too on what you think about that, because I thought it was fascinating. You see, I've been thinking about that one though. When Jill sent me the email, I said, oh, she knows all my weak spots, because I've been thinking about that. I teach, as you're going to the next person, like I told you, I teach a class for first-year black men. And this is hilarious. I've been teaching that class since 2004. And so I feel very comfortable teaching that class and going over it, and some of the things and what these guys experience. I guess I can also tell you that since 2008, I've also taught a class for first-year black women every single year. But I almost never mention it like I do the black men class, because I feel like, well, I probably shouldn't say that publicly. So it's real. It's very interesting, because I'm always thinking, just like, it could be brought up. They're like, hey, but you're not a black woman, and it's very fascinating, because in 2008, this also happened at SIUE, by the way. In 2008, someone was like, hey, we just need you to fill in for this one semester to teach this class. They said that, and I said, just this one semester, fall 2000? I said, I'll do it, fall 2008. And I'm still there. Anyway, but it's fascinating to me that even in my own speech, I downplay that, though. You almost never hear me talk about it like that. Hey, thank you.